Amat merat ike tesolderat ikmerut.
Hey y'all, Dave here. Thanks for stopping by and checking out my video. I very much appreciate it. Before I start, and while I remember, don't forget to like and share the video if you find it useful, interesting, or enjoyable. I'm a small channel, so you'd be helping me out a lot by doing so. And also a huge thank you to Rev and Fidel once again for being my Patreon supporter, as well as just being very supportive and encouraging in general. It means a lot to me. As with many of my other videos, the topic of this one was inspired by a recent discussion with some other atheists. Though this is an argument I've been seeing for years on places like Twitter and Facebook. That argument being that it is irrational to believe an unfalsifiable proposition. Like this person argues, and this person argues, and well, all these people argue. We'll come back to these tweets later as part of the discussion though. Like I say, this is an argument that I've been hearing for many years now. One thing I've not heard though is a sufficient justification for why it is irrational to believe an unfalsifiable proposition. I have heard some justifications, but none that actually sufficiently explain why it is irrational to believe an unfalsifiable proposition. In this video, I'll discuss some of the reasons I've been given for why it is irrational to believe an unfalsifiable proposition, look at a few tweets, and take a brief look at falsification, what it means to be rational, and why I'm of the opinion that it is not irrational to believe an unfalsifiable proposition. Let's begin with a quick look at falsification and falsifiability. Looking at this tweet here, you would assume that falsification is a part of logic in and of itself. The tweet makes it appear that believing an unfalsifiable claim shows that someone doesn't understand the laws of logic or how fallacies work, giving the impression that falsification is used in logic to demarcate a rational belief from an irrational belief. No such demarcation exists within logic though, and there is no fallacy that picks out believing an unfalsifiable proposition as fallacious reasoning. Falsifiability is about demarcating science from pseudoscience, not rationality from irrationality. The idea of falsification was first introduced by Karl Popper in his 1934 work, The Logic of Scientific Discovery. Expansions on his ideas can also be found in his 1963 work, Conjectures and Refutations. And there is plenty of literature that both supports and critiques Popper's ideas. As I just mentioned, one of the purposes of Popper's work was to find a way to sort science from pseudoscience. In his work, he mentions theories like Marx's theory of class, psychoanalysis, and Einstein's theory of general relativity. When examining Marx's theory of class and theories of psychoanalysis, Popper noticed one very glaring thing. What he noticed was that when it came to these theories, every bit of new evidence that was brought forward seemed to support the theory and help prove the theory. Even when it came to competing theories, the data and evidence was said to support both theories at the same time. However, what was different about Einstein's theory is that it took risks when it came to the predictions it made. Einstein's theory predicted certain events happening, and if those events were not found to happen, then the theory would have been proven to be false. This, Popper argued, was what set scientific theories apart from pseudoscientific theories. The ability to be proven false. A good scientific theory is one that allows us to show it is wrong. A theory where it does not just assimilate all data in order to prove it right, but certain data where if that data is not found, then that theory is not correct. Consider something along the lines of evolution. When it comes to evolution, finding fossils in the wrong layer would disqualify evolution as a theory. It riskily predicts the layers that the fossils will be found in, and so far all of those predictions have panned out. So that is basically what falsification is. It is a way of demarcating a scientific theory from a pseudoscientific theory. There is lots more to be said about demarcating a scientific theory from a pseudoscientific one, of course. However, that will be for a more in-depth video. For this video, we simply need to understand what falsification is and its purposes. Falsification speaks nothing to rationality. It does not even speak to rationality when it comes to scientific theories. A theory that isn't falsifiable is not necessarily irrational. It just doesn't fit the bill of being scientific. It does not even necessarily mean that a theory is incorrect if it is unfalsifiable. The theory could be absolutely correct and unfalsifiable. Falsifiability also speaks nothing of beliefs. It would be better if we held beliefs that could be proven wrong, of course, but it is not necessarily an indicator of their rationality that they are not. When it comes to our beliefs, rationality instead speaks to our reasoning about them. There is much debate that goes on about what it means to be rational. Some argue that humans are not rational, some argue that humans are rational. There are various accounts of what it means to be rational. For a deeper dive into what it means to be rational, then feel free to check out my video To Be or Not to Be Rational, where I give a small presentation on the rationality debate and explain various accounts of rationality. The standard picture of rationality argues that to be rational is to reason according to the rules of logic and probability theory. So let's work from there for this discussion. There is nothing in logic that speaks to beliefs being falsifiable. It talks about the law of identity and the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction. It speaks of inferences and how to ensure that our conclusions follow from our premises. It teaches us that when we accept certain conclusions, we should also accept the entailments of those conclusions. Logic teaches us to reason better, most certainly. There is nothing in logic itself that teaches us that we should only accept falsifiable conclusions, though. An argument could certainly be made using logic for why it is better to accept conclusions that can be proven false. But logic itself does not state that only conclusions that can be proven false are acceptable or logical. So when someone says something like this, they are also showing that they know very little about the laws of logic and fallacies either. Unfalsifiable claims are not illogical by their nature, and there is nothing in the laws of logic that speaks to them. There is a fallacy that speaks of unfalsifiable claims being fallacious, but that speaks to claiming that a theory or hypothesis is definitely true or false. It speaks nothing about believing that claim to be more or less likely true. As stated, another condition of rationality is that the reasoning is according to probability theory. Here we can speak of something like Bayesian reasoning. Bayesian reasoning is a means of applying probability theory to inductive reasoning. So when it comes to reasoning about unfalsifiable propositions, we can use probability theory to think about the likelihood of them being true or false. We may have no means necessary to prove them false, at least for now, but we can reason about their likelihood. So an unfalsifiable proposition does not seem to go against rationality. We can reason about them using logic, and we can reason about them using probability theory. Both things that the standard picture argues are required for rationality. Rationality is something that is far more complicated than simply stating that it is irrational to believe X. I know most atheists will hate to hear this, but even belief in God can be rational, because the rationality of that belief depends on lots of factors. The same can be said for not believing in God or believing that God does not exist. If someone was to argue that God is imaginary, but then also argue that they are not claiming that God does not exist, then that is an irrational belief. As stated, a part of reasoning logically is to accept the entailments of our arguments. Let's look at the claim that something is imaginary. If we are to argue that something is imaginary, it is the same as arguing that the thing in question exists only in the mind and not in reality. So to argue something is imaginary is to argue that something does not exist. Meaning that to argue that God is imaginary, but that you are not claiming that God does not exist, is not accepting the entailments of your own argument. It is to hold contradictory and illogical beliefs, making that claim and that belief irrational. Like I say, rationality is much more complicated. In order to know whether a person's belief is rational or irrational, we would need to know their reasons for holding that belief. Why they believe it, how they got to that belief, the reasons they hold it, how it holds in comparison to their other beliefs, their background information, and much more. Holding an unfalsifiable belief may be less reasonable than holding a falsifiable belief, but it is not unreasonable, nor is it illogical or irrational by its very nature. Of course, there will be those that argue here that it is never rational or logical to believe an unfalsifiable proposition, just as this person here did, and argue that it goes against rationality to believe an unfalsifiable claim, like in this example. When challenged about this, one of the arguments I got back was that if it's rational, then it's rational to believe that there is an invisible unicorn that lives in their garage, or universe farting pixies, or some other equally ridiculous claim. The problem is that is bad reasoning in and of itself. The argument is not that it is always rational to believe an unfalsifiable proposition or claim, or that it is rational to believe all unfalsifiable propositions or claims. The argument is that it is not always irrational to believe an unfalsifiable proposition or claim. The claim being unfalsifiable is not an indicator of whether it is rational or irrational in and of itself. As I just stated, it's the reasoning behind the belief that determines it as being rational or irrational. So in the case of believing that God exists or believing God does not exist, it is not the belief itself that is rational or irrational. It is why we believe that makes it rational or irrational. There is much fuss made about rationality and logic in the atheist and skeptic online sphere, and it is held in extremely high regard by most. But unfortunately, few understand what it means to be logical or rational. Few have ever taken the time to actually look into the subject, which is why an idea like unfalsifiable claims are automatically irrational or go against the law of logic is so prevalent. It's also why so many skeptics and atheists don't realize their own rationality when it comes to their own beliefs and arguments. For many, it is not the reasoning that counts, it is the position in and of itself that counts. As I mentioned, there's a video on my channel called To Be or Not to Be Rational, where I discuss this idea in greater detail. Another common claim that can be seen regarding this is this one, that you simply cannot justify an unfalsifiable belief, and that is why it is irrational. However, this is simply not true. Let's turn this around. If we take something like an invisible pink unicorn, for example, the claim that there is an invisible pink unicorn is unfalsifiable. There is no scientific hypothesis for it, and no tests for it. There is no theory for it, and no falsifiability conditions for it. Many people also argue and agree that it is an unfalsifiable claim. So let's just go with their claim that it is unfalsifiable. This means that the claim that it is true is unfalsifiable, and also means that the claim that it is false is unfalsifiable. After all, the conclusion that it is false is the falsification, meaning that all skeptics and atheists should remain neutral about the existence of the invisible pink unicorn. None should be arguing that it is a false claim, as that would be irrational and unjustifiable according to this argument. Yet it seems to me that there is a simple justification for believing that it is false. Color, such as pink, is the property of vision and light. Color is light bouncing off an object and reflecting into our eyes at particular wavelengths. An invisible object is not reflecting any color. That is one of the reasons it is invisible. If it had color, it would not be invisible. Some might argue here that perhaps it is pink, but pink in a way that we cannot see. And sure, but then that's speaking of an invisible pink, which is incoherent, which would mean that it's still invisible. For it to be pink in the way that we know the color pink, it would have to be visible to us. This seems to me to be a good justification to believe that the invisible pink unicorn does not exist. If the proposition or claim is unfalsifiable, as many claim, then it would appear that there is at least one unfalsifiable claim where there is justification to believe it does not exist. You could start to throw in all kinds of counterexamples to try and keep it relevant, but you still have a justification for believing it does not exist. And the same holds true of believing that God does not exist. There are many arguments and justifications for the belief that God does not exist. They can be found in counter-apologetics, philosophy of religion, and more. We can find them from people like Graham Oppy, Stephen Law, J.L. Mackie, J.H. Sobel, and many more. There are lots of justifications for believing that God does not exist, even though it is claimed that it is an unfalsifiable proposition. The problem here isn't that there can be no justifications for believing an unfalsifiable claim. The problem is that those that think that start from the position that it is unjustifiable. They start from the idea that it is always irrational or never justifiable justified based on the idea of falsification being a demarcation for rationality and reason, while disregarding all the evidence that it is not a demarcation for rationality and reason, and disregarding all the evidence that there are unfalsifiable beliefs that can be justified. Anyway, I'll wrap it up here, as I want to keep the video short. This isn't meant to be a deep dive on falsification or rationality, or even a thorough, robust argument for justification for believing unfalsifiable beliefs. It is meant simply as an explanation for why it is not automatically irrational if a belief is unfalsifiable, and to explain that claims that it is are false, as well as claims that an unjustifiable belief cannot be justified are false too. The argument that it is always irrational to believe an unfalsifiable claim comes from the same place that the argument that you cannot prove a negative comes from. It comes from people that have never studied any of the related topics or even looked into any of the related topics, but speaking as if they have extensive knowledge of the related topics. Just as with the claim you can't prove a negative, it comes from people simply repeating what they've heard and never questioning it, or believing it based on motivated reasoning. To some extent, I think part of this argument comes from the idea that it can never be rational to believe in God. An easy way to argue that it can never be rational to believe in God is to argue for it based on the idea that God is unfalsifiable. In order to hold on to that position, the skeptic or atheist is willing to throw out strong atheism as a sacrifice. They are willing to give up on reasonable positions in order to hold on to the idea that it is never reasonable to believe in God. Yet, if they were to actually study these topics, they would find that much of what they're claiming is false. Even the claim that it can never be rational to believe God exists is a false claim. As mentioned earlier in the video, rationality is not about conclusions as such, but about how we got to those conclusions. You can believe true things for irrational reasons, and you can believe false things for rational reasons. Like I said earlier, there are lots of atheists and skeptics in the online sphere that hold reason, logic, and rationality in the highest of esteem. They just don't hold enough esteem for it to actually look into it beyond calling themselves rational for not believing certain things. So yeah, that's enough from me on this one. If someone tells you that it is always irrational to believe an unfalsifiable proposition, you should stop and take pause. Perhaps even stop to ask them why they believe that. In many instances, you'll find that it is simply an assertion. Ask them if they have ever read anything on rationality, or whether they have ever read anything on falsification, or even studied logic. You'll often find that they haven't, and that they are simply repeating things that they have heard without question, or their reasoning for the claim is faulty or motivated by other reasons. Their argument certainly isn't based on what logic or the rationality debate tells us. Take care all, hopefully I'll see you again soon. If you have any questions or want to argue that it's always irrational to believe an unfalsifiable claim, then feel free to leave me a comment down below. Until the next time, I hope life treats you well and you treat life well. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video or found it useful. And don't forget you can find my Patreon link in the description. Thanks once again to Rev and Fidel for supporting me. I really appreciate it. Bye!